From game day to signing day, breaking down every snap and all the news on Alabama's top football recruits. It's time for Crimson and Blue Chips with your host, John Garcia Jr.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome in, welcome back to another edition of Crimson and Blue Chips. We are your audio authority on all things Alabama football, as well as recruiting. I'm your host, John Garcia Jr., and we've got to play some catch up on this Thursday. Plenty to revisit from the opening finals, new verbal commitments in for Alabama, attrition going down for Alabama, injuries going down for Alabama. As you can tell, plenty to get to on today's program. So we're going to try to let you guys dictate the large part of that conversation. A lot of Q&A through various platforms on Crimson and Blue Chips, cabcpod@gmail.com, cabcpod on Twitter and Instagram, Facebook, Crimson and Blue Chips, all over the place. There's a lot of questions, and hopefully we will be able to answer a lot of them through the remainder of today's program. So we will touch on the new commitments, Jahleel Billingsley, Mr. Metchie, etc. in the class of 2019, and of course report on the latest news coming through for your Crimson Tide. So strap in, ladies and gentlemen. We're going to spend a lot of time with you, our listeners, on this Thursday edition, catch-up edition of Crimson and Blue Chips. Before we completely dive into this episode of CABC, want to extend our thoughts continually, publicly, as we've done so privately with the Rico family. Many of you know him as West Coast Tide fans on Twitter. Eddie Rico is his actual name. He suffered a stroke about a week ago and has been fighting hard to come on back since then. And late on Wednesday evening, our time, of course, his name is West Coast Tide fan, so he's on the West Coast. His wife, Jenny, shared great news about his recovery, and Eddie was actually released from the hospital today. Now, I'm not a Bama fan, but I am pretty well in tune with the Alabama fan community, and really, he's not at the forefront of that conversation on Twitter, socially, all of those things. He's really grown kind of a community of his own with how supportive he's been through a million different Alabama avenues. I've talked to him on many occasions. I've even helped him promote some of his stuff, put out work, and he is a great guy, deserving of all of that and more. So the Alabama fans and community rallied around him over the last week, and according to his wife Jenny via Facebook, Eddie was released from the hospital. So prayers have been answered. Certainly continued good vibes, good thoughts with the Rico family. 5 days in the hospital is obviously no joke, but really cool to see just how humans rally behind other humans, and some of us know Eddie fairly well. Some of us don't. Some of you may just know him on Twitter as WC Tide fans. Yet and still, any efforts were appreciated and obviously warranted in this scenario. So this show is for Eddie. He's been a very loyal supporter all the way through, and the least we could do is show him some love on the podcast, as we've tried to do over the last several years, but obviously more so in this trying time. So if you're listening, Eddie, the Alabama community is still behind you, even though seemingly the biggest hurdle is now behind you, which we're all incredibly grateful for. So as I said, this show is for my man Eddie Rico, West Coast Tide fans. And, you know, he might have to play some catch up too, right? He might have a little bit of downtime, so hopefully he can separate from the toughness and get lost a little bit in the Crimson Tide news and notes and recruiting news that has gone down over the last week because it has been incredibly busy. We missed the Tuesday show. That was our bad logistical situation that we're not going to delve into. But a lot has gone on since our last program, whether it is new commitments, as we mentioned earlier at the top of the show. Jahleel Billingsley, four-star tight end out of Chicago, Illinois, committed on July 6th, not very long after John Metchie committed out of the Petty School in New Jersey, but really out of Toronto, Canada. Another four-star pass catcher, a guy who's got an incredible story. I urge everybody to read Steve Wiltfong's update on John Metchie, the new Alabama wide receiver commitment, whenever they get a chance. His family's moved around. Mom didn't want him to play ball. His older brothers weren't allowed to beyond high school, and he found a way to get to prep school and obviously establish himself as a national recruit and end up at Alabama. So a really cool story there as Alabama addresses more and more needs. If you look at some of these most recent verbal commitments, what you see is Alabama kicking off a position. And I think that is so important in college football recruiting, in building a class. Sure, there are going to be positions where Bama is loaded and there's a ton of kids, right? O-line. I mean, defensive line's got 6 verbal commitments right now. Quarterbacks, there's already 2 in the class. So you know there's going to be volume at certain positions, but in the positions we don't talk about as much in terms of numbers, it's still important to fill those and kick those off. Kind of like having a starting point in a story, right? Act 1. And Alabama's been able to do that several times over the last 3 weeks. Keelan Robinson committed as the first running back in the class. And as we mentioned, Jahleel Billingsley, the first tight end, Metchie, the first wide receiver in this class. Those guys are important because they give you kind of that leeway, that flexibility. So now, let's say Bama is still looking at other tight ends, which I believe it is. Now it could focus a ton of efforts on the top couple of guys. And if something doesn't fall through with them, you've already got one locked in. So it really, it almost, it's almost enough equity to start taking more risks in recruiting, allocating more resources to some of the top guys instead of sort of spreading the wealth to a wider pool at various positions. So maybe at tight end, Keon Zipperer can become the focus moving forward. Maybe at running back, all of the chips can go towards the Trey Sanders basket, and maybe still some Jerry and Ely as well at that position. Maybe the board can narrow a little bit when some guys break through with Metchie on board. Maybe the George Pickens, chips can be pushed in a little bit further. Things like that. I think that stuff is incredibly important in a class. Sure, you want the volume, you want the position where there's got to be a lot of guys, right? You want all those linemen, O-line, D-line. You want multiple safeties, things like that. Absolutely. And Bama's done that already with Brandon Turnage and DeMarco Hellams. But you also need to address those positions that maybe you were going to take just 1 or 2. Because the sooner you kind of lock it in, as I said, the more you can spread the wealth elsewhere and focus on some of the bigger fish still out there in this class of 2019. We're going to look at some of these guys here just a little bit. We'll do a little bit of a live evaluation because I'm not going to lie to you, I have not seen Jahleel Billingsley or John Metchie in person this year. So what we have is some available tape. So let's take a look at it together. First with Billingsley, again, a tight end, a flex tight end, 6'4", 216, 4.64 laser 40-yard dash, which at that size is damn good. It's part of the reason why he is a consensus top 300 prospect, a tight end sitting just outside of the top 10 right now. So those are the vitals for Billingsley. You pop on some of the video and you see immediately the vertical speed, his ball skills, his awareness, and it's very clear early on this is a tight end in the year 2018. He's not going to be in line a ton. He's not going to be chipping on defensive ends, getting to the second level, focusing on playing the right angles as a blocker, and maybe one day he will. But right now, he ain't that. He is a throw the ball all over the yard, matchup nightmare type of tight end. Too big and athletic for safeties and linebackers. I think he's just a guy that it's like corners have to cover him, but he's 6'4", 220. So how does that work in the open field? And this kid actually has some decent ability after the catch at that size. And again, 4'6", laser 40 shows as well. And really, the Phillips Academy, which is his high school in Chicago, they utilize that. I mean, it's like the offense is built around him, or the passing game is built around him. And he's lining up all over the field, detached from the line of scrimmage. And he can make plays there after the catch, as I said, in space. He can be the traditional tight end and kind of box you out at the sticks, if you will. But really, I think this is an athlete who plays much more like a big wide receiver. So obviously, you want to know, can he assimilate and become a balanced tight end, and can he put on the weight? Because he's split out so much, it's like he is a wide receiver. And there's some video on 24/7 Sports of him working with Talia Tagovailoa at the Pro Football Hall of Fame camp that just wrapped up here this week, and it looks like Talia's throwing to one of his wide receivers. It doesn't really look like a tight end. So intriguing prospect. Again, you wonder how long is it going to take for him to show some balance? How long is it going to take for him to look like a more conventional tight end, or does he kind of live in that jumbo athlete? I'm kind of positionless, situation. I mean, there's no right or wrong answer here. So, you know, um, it's something to watch moving forward. But again, as we see in today's nature, this is the type of tight end that people want. People want a guy who is a pass first, bigger receiver guy, not necessarily the Jason Witten balanced tight end who's going to be just as critical for you as a blocker than as a reliable underneath wide receiver. So he certainly fits the whole notion of Nick Saban adjusting and moving towards this millennium and all that fun stuff. As for John Metchie, again, a kid who's moved all around the country, played all over the country and countries, now playing in New Jersey at the Petty School, which has churned out some pretty good prospects over the years. You see another raw athlete. I think with him and Billingsley, not a ton of polish there, but the raw ability, explosion, athleticism, awareness, body control. But what you like about Beachy in particular is as he develops as a route runner, things like that, maybe catches the ball a little bit better, works on those things. You see a suddenness about John Metchie, and he's not a tiny dude. He's not a Jalen Waddle who you expect to be sudden because he's 5'9", 5'10", a buck 65. No, Michi is closer to 200 pounds, listed at 6 foot even. So this is more of an Xavier Williams, Calvin Ridley type of size coming out of high school, bigger actually than both of those guys. So a suddenness that is very obvious on tape for a guy at that size becomes very intriguing. Short area quickness, ability to stop and start is so paramount in this space game, in this nature of college football where we're at right now. And Michi shows a ton of that. He also plays some defense for the Petty School where you see a lot of the wide receiver skills shine through, whether it's awareness, instincts, ball skills. You get a little physicality in there as well, so that's nice. You'd rather have just a football player than a guy who is going to live in that stereotypical world of wide receivers. Maybe they're not as willing to become physical, not as willing to get dirty, as they say, muck it up, physical it up. He is clearly willing to do those things, which makes you think that he's got some upside as a blocker as well, which is, as we know, pretty damn important on a Nick Saban team. If you're going to play considerable snaps at wide receiver, you've got to block and kind of earn it that way. But just talking about him as a wide receiver, you love the suddenness, the athleticism, the raw ability. You see it. You see it, and that's where you would rather begin the conversation than saying, well, the guy's limited, but he's really polished and he's really worked on his craft. You can work on that craft, but God-given athleticism and instincts and talent is where you'd rather begin because you can mold a player from there. So I think a nice raw talent in John Metchie. I look for Alabama to pair him with a wide receiver who is on the other side of that spectrum, a bigger 6'2", 6'3" type of guy, maybe more polished as a pass catcher. And now you have a counter, right? We talk about taking quarterbacks, two quarterbacks in a class, one dual threat, one pro style, two running backs in a class, one kind of all purpose, one is a big bruising Bama back, conventionally speaking. Receiver, I think you can do that same thing. If you're going to take two, which is what we think right now for Alabama, you take your guy who's quicker, more explosive, more athletic, which would be Michi, and then you take a bigger guy, bigger, stronger outside presence, whether it's a Devontae Lee out of Louisiana, or George Pickens out of Hoover High School, a Jamison Williams, who's a bit of a longer, leaner type, but he looks more like a wide receiver one kid out of the Midlands. So there's several options here for Alabama, and as I said earlier, with these guys being the first at their positions, now you can kind of reshuffle the deck, reallocate some of those resources, and push harder for some of those top couple of guys on the board. So the Crimson Tide rolling on the recruiting trail. If you have kept up, that is 20 verbal commitments from 8 different states. That is including Washington, D.C., the District of Columbia, Shane Lee, the Alabama linebacker commitment representing D.C. And real quick on Shane Lee, by the way, how about his week at the opening? Now, I was focused more on linemen, and if you follow me on Twitter, you've seen me put out a million different O-line, D-line videos. That's kind of become my niche at this event. But I did watch some 7-on-7, and Shane Lee held his own where I watched him. But people who watched him much more than I did were thoroughly impressed with him in space, thoroughly impressed with him as a pass defender, which is the opposite of what he's actually known for as a 6-foot, 250-pound linebacker. He did well enough to make the all-tournament team from the opening. So this isn't, those of you who hate on us at 24/7 Sports, oh, this guy's rated high because he's going to Bama. Well, it wouldn't be this fan base. It'd be every other fan base, right? Yeah, we didn't name him to that. The opening named him to that. So he's a top 5 backer in the country on 24/7, top 100 prospect. And now, all of a sudden, he's showing much more balanced of a game than certainly I gave him credit for. So shout out to Shane Lee. That's got to excite Alabama fans, especially right now with linebacker being such a transitive position on the roster with the dismissal of Vandarius Cowan and the injury to Terrell Lewis. That's got to be great news on the recruiting trail for Alabama fans. So Lee is one of 20 guys on board right now for the Tide, still very much the number one class in America, and obviously by default the number one class in the SEC as well. So you see some versatility with Bama's group. We've talked about the in-state crop for 2019 and how big it was always going to be in this class, and that still holds true. 7 of the 20 commitments from within state lines, and obviously several others from within state lines. Pretty darn high on the board, beginning with Clay Webb and company. So that number's only going to go up, and that's even before these kids start their senior season. So that's not even taking into consideration senior emergers or guys who were on the bubble who get over the hump as they do kick off their senior season and things like that. So this Bama class is rolling. There's no doubt about it. As I said, 20 verbal commitments. We hadn't even really hit on Byron Young, but we might as well at this point as well. He committed 2 days before the pass-catching duo that we have already delved into. So let's hit on Byron Young here just for a little while. Look, this is something we've talked about for a long time, right? Byron Young named Alabama his leader, 2 months ago? Something like that. more than 2 months ago as we look at it. And it really seemed like a matter of, okay, Bama's his leader. Nobody else is really there. Is Bama going to take the kid? Are they going to wait? Things like that. And obviously, Bama had the green light in for Byron Young, 6'4", 279-pound defensive end out of Mississippi, Laurel, Mississippi, West Jones High School. And that alone should make Bama fans pretty darn happy. Been really tough for Nick Saban in the state of Mississippi. I believe you can count the blue chip recruits he has pulled in from that state on just one hand in 10 years, 10 plus years now. So, not that it's a huge red flag, but tangibly, Mississippi has been tough for Alabama, and he currently has two blue chip recruits from that state already on board with Brandon Turnage and now Byron Young. We know there's a ton of other guys still on the board from that state, mainly Nakobe Dean, the top linebacker maybe in America, Nathan Pickering, who's currently committed to Mississippi State, still giving Bama a pretty hard look, as well as a few other guys in the state of Mississippi. So if that is true, if he has only signed 4 or 5 blue chip recruits from Mississippi, period, when you're thinking of the Nigel Knotts of the world, the Raekwon Davises of the world, imagine getting 3 or 4 in one class. That is actually a possibility in 2019 with Alabama, and Byron Young is the latest tangible example of that. He committed on the 4th of July, very late, kind of while everybody was sleeping. We touched on it last week, but we really hadn't jumped more into the Byron Young thing, and mainly because it was kind of expected. It was seemingly a matter of when and not if, as long as Alabama would take the kid, and obviously they took the kid, and I think that's going to be as solid a commitment as Alabama wants it to be moving forward. Conventional defensive end, definitely a strong side type. He shows good short area quickness, good athleticism, good motor as well, which is something you want to see from a high school prospect. If he's going to be considered raw or potentially he's playing out of position, you want to see maximum effort on these great plays, and he's doing that. Needs to work on his polish, particularly disengaging skills, playing with a lower pad level. Some of the things we say for a lot of teenage defensive linemen, because it's easy to pop up and just be bigger, stronger, and a better athlete than the blocker in front of you. But you want to see a little bit more of that from Byron Young, the newest defensive commitment for the Alabama Crimson Tide. But he's got the flash. He's got the flash plays that you want to see, where he gets his hands on the blocker and he is replacing himself behind where that blocker was immediately thereafter. And he's able to penetrate inside and outside, which is another thing that is good to see early on with a high school tape. Obviously, Byron Young, a ton of time in between now and most likely when he's going to actually suit up and play significantly for Alabama. But there is certainly a foundation there. Again, 6'4", 279, top 10 defensive end in the country on the strong side via the 24/7 Sports composite. Our next segment on the pod was going to be more of a reflective of what had been going on with Cowan and with Terrell Lewis's injury and kind of the shifts going on within the current Alabama football team. But forget that. Let's just jump to you guys. Let's pick up where you guys would like to aid the conversation. And I want to go back really up to a week because we hadn't done a ton of Q&A over the last week or so, focused so much on the opening finals. So I want to go back actually to West Coast Tide fans who had a really good question that I never got around to. So I want to kick off the conversation there. And again, Eddie, our thoughts are with you and your family. But 6 days ago, you were curious, with so many defensive end commitments, which ones do you think remain at defensive end or become defensive tackles or outside linebackers? I love this question. See, Eddie knows me very well, and we're in the projection business, right? So a lot of these guys that we have listed as defensive end, weak side defensive end, strong side defensive end, defensive tackle, etc., that doesn't mean they're going to play those positions at the next level. And a lot of factors can go into that. Obviously, the most important is where in the world does the kid go to play football? And as we obviously know, we're talking Alabama here, and that's a half dozen guys right now in this class of 2019. So West Coast wants to know how many of those defensive ends stick to that projection. So the guys currently committed to Alabama projected to play defensive end include Antonio Alfano, Kevin Harris, Byron Young, Justin E. Boygby as well. So that's 4 of the 6 D linemen. Of course, there are a couple of D tackles in that group with Rashad Cheney and the in-stater in DJ Dale. But of those 4 defensive end projections right now on 24/7 Sports, I think you could see it go both ways with a couple of them. I think Alfano is perhaps the most versatile of maybe any defensive player, period, that Alabama has in this group, whether it's defensive tackle, defensive end, standing up, playing coverage, rushing the passer, playing the run, just being a football player. Alfano is that guy. So I think his versatility could lend for him to not be a conventional thinking of that defensive end spot. So West Coast, I think he's a guy who could be an outside linebacker or a hand in the dirt guy. But I expect, especially given his size, 6'4", 285, I expect him to be a hand in the dirt guy well more than not. And then you look at the newest pledge, Byron Young, 6'4", 279. He looks bigger than Alfano, even though he's listed a little bit smaller than the New Jersey native. I think he is kind of a lock to keep his hand in the dirt and play somewhere on the defensive front. I almost think it's a foregone conclusion he moves inside with his length and quickness to go along with a good frame. So I think he's got some traits to play inside. But remember, this is Alabama. So conventionally speaking, if you're looking at a 3-4 approach, that defensive end technically is a guy who's on the outside shade of the guard, inside shade of the tackle, somewhere in that bubble, which in most other defenses is listed as a defensive tackle. So you have to look at it through the crimson and white glasses. But look, at the same token, in this age, you're basically a nickel defense or sub at all times. So now the front changes. It typically goes to more of a conventional 4-man front, and then you have some of those conventional spots kind of up for grabs. So I think Byron can do a little bit of both, but only because of the team that he is committed to play for. So I think he's more stationary, certainly compared to Alfano. And then the other 2 guys they fit in one certain mold. Justin Eboigbe, very athletic, very raw, but I think he is bound to be on the edge. Now, in Alabama's scheme, that could mean stand-up outside guy or hand-in-the-dirt guy, but I think his frame, legit 6'5", getting closer to 275 now, I think he is a hand-in-the-dirt edge player who becomes a great pass rusher, but really is an edge setter and run defender primarily and early in his Tuscaloosa career. So I think he's kind of locked in there. And then with Kevin Harris, the weak side defensive end, longer, leaner, faster. And I think that is going to point him in the jack linebacker direction considerably in this Alabama defense. The jack or the Sam linebacker position. I think him having his hand in the dirt and in anywhere but the edge in any capacity, I think would not be very wise. He is incredibly thin, incredibly inconsistent because he is so thin and lacks, a polished group of moves as a pass rusher. So he's like that closer in baseball, right? If you throw 99, guess what? You're not going to worry about throwing the curveball and more breaking balls and the slider and getting cute with all of that. Yeah, you may use it as a put away pitch against a good hitter, but 9 times out of 10, you're like, I'm throwing 99 and you can't catch up. So a whole crap ton of fastballs are coming at you. And that's kind of Kevin Harris. He's got that 99-mile-an-hour fastball, and he's going to throw it 85% of the time right now. So that will lend him to playing truly on the edge more so than any of these other guys who are listed as defensive ends in any capacity in terms of that projection. But a very good question. You know, I'm big on versatility and guys moving around, and West Coast always on top of it, kind of led me right into that one on Twitter at CABCPod. Another Twitter question comes from Raphael Monroy. He's hashtagging CABC, which is yet another way to get in communication with us. He says, hope all is well. Next man up. Good thing for depth and strong incoming classes. I think Raphael's referring to the Vandarius Cowan / Terrell Lewis situations. And Rafi's going back to the well here. So Ben Davis talk starts again. Do you think it finally clicks for him? At some point it has to, right? And at some point his preparation will lead to some type of opportunity. Whether it's conventionally as an inside guy, which I think is still where he's more comfortable, or as an outside guy where he has some ability to play in space and rush the passer as a great 5-star athlete coming out of high school. That remains to be seen, but literally in the last 48 hours, there has been a setback for this 2018 season at the inside and outside linebacker position. So Ben Davis is a guy who should be brought up more, not just a maybe type of guy, a guy who should get his time in between now and September 1 to finally let people know whether or not he belongs, whether it's inside or outside. And that's a determination that Nick and Pete Golding and Tosh Lupoy will be able to sit down and break down and make at some point. But if ever there was a time where the opportunity seemed to be the most timely and appropriate for Ben, I think it's now. I think it's now. We know Bama's going to focus on linebacker recruiting a ton in this class. They picked up some last year as well. So the clock is certainly ticking now more than ever for Ben Davis. But remember, still a relatively young football player and a relatively young collegiate athlete as well. So let's not close the book or even begin to close that book, even if things aren't as positive as most of us expected through 2 years as a Crimson Tider. And then Raphael with a follow-up question here. Are there any 2020 recruits that would be a 5-star in 2019? Roll Tide Roll from Long Island, New York. Very good question on a lot of fronts there, Raphael. The class of 2020, it's feeling like a great class. It's really early, and a lot of things are going to change, and we still don't know a ton about the depth of that group. But if you're talking about guys who would be 5-stars if they were a year older from that 2020 class, you go to the top 10 of those prospects, and you see multiple guys that you don't really have to make a deep argument for as 5-stars in this current class. It begins with the number 1 player in the country, Brian Brees. Saw him live and in color and in person at the opening in full pads. This dude belonged. Now, did he have the same type of going into his junior year experience at the opening that we saw from Rashawn Gary and Nolan Smith and guys like that? No. Those guys made it abundantly clear that they were the number 1 players in their class, in my opinion. I don't think Brian did that, but he was just a notch under there, where you saw exactly why. Because look, I'm going to be honest with you guys, and hopefully that's the sole reason you click this darn podcast, is to get some honesty. Going into the opening, I said, okay, number one player in the country, consensus number one player in the country. His video is great. He's 6'5", 290. He's got so many things going for him on paper, but a little part of me said he's from Damascus, Maryland. He hasn't been on this stage, and he's a year younger than everybody he's going up against. There was a part of me that thought he would fold in the setting. And there are multiple ways to fold in this setting. The most literal is losing a ton of reps in one-on-ones, not showing any physicality, promise, ability to be coached up, and things like that. That is, it's clear, right? You don't have to dig deeper for that. But as I said earlier, I focus on the linemen at these events. So guess what? When I'm logging literally hundreds of video clips, guess what I'm seeing? I'm seeing the guys who are competitive. I'm seeing the guys who aren't competitive. I'm seeing the guys who want to bounce back after losses, and I'm seeing the guys who would rather tuck their tail in between their legs and go in the opposite direction. And the reason I see that is because everything is labeled. So every lineman has the same opportunity to go a certain amount of times relative to his position, correct? One of my favorite things about Brian, he was a dog. He wanted to compete. He wanted to go against the best offensive tackles. Kenyon Green, Darnell Wright, Evan Neal, Pierce Quick. He wanted those guys. And even when he lost, which he did, he wanted more. That alone, if there is a rule book for how to get on John Garcia's good side from a recruiting perspective, show some effort, show some cojones, as we say, and bring it. Be a dog. Be closer to that side of the coin. If you lose, take the L like a man and get back out there. There were a lot of kids, and all of them were literally a year ahead of Brian, who didn't do that. I'm not going to throw out the names right now. I'm not going to do it to them. But you'll know. if you guys ask about them or they come up, you'll hear my tone change. So moving forward, if we're talking about the opening and my tone changes when it comes to a lineman, now you have a big reason potentially why. But that is not the case with Brian. So he definitely would be a 5-star in this 2019 class. Now, he wouldn't be the number one player in the country. He wouldn't be the number one defensive end in the country. He'd be a top 5 defensive end behind that great group at the top, the three amigos, I guess. I don't know. We got to give them a nickname between Nolan Smith, Kayvon Thibodeau, and Zach Harrison. Those three can absolutely go in any class. So I think Brian would be somewhere underneath them, but he's very different compared to them as well. I think all of those guys are kind of, at the end of the day, classic edge rushers, and I think Brian is more of a true defensive end, not necessarily a guy who is going to flash as much off of the edge. Nolan Smith, Thibodeau, and Harris, I mean, these guys scream off the edge with athleticism, freakish ability, and despite carrying less weight than the blocker 9 times out of 10, really 10 times out of 10 at the highest level. Brian's a bit different. He's 290, so he's going to go at you as much as he's going to try to go around you in a simple sense. So I think he's very different compared to those guys, but I would still rank those 3 edge rushers a little bit higher than Brian, but he would still be a 5-star. The guy number 2 in the country right now for 24/7 Sports, Justin Flo, a linebacker. He's another one who was at the opening, and you didn't know he was a young guy until somebody said, oh, yeah, that kid is 2020. You're like, what? 6'2", 225, built like a rock, athletic as heck. Really couldn't say enough good things about him. It's hard for linebackers, especially inside linebacker types, to be 5-stars early on because we want to see space game. We want to see pass rushing ability and all that. Justin has that. He has that capability. I think he would be in that Nakobe Dean threshold for potentially the top linebacker in the country should he be 2019. Savell Smalls, legitimate edge rusher. I think he would be a 5-star. DJ Uigalele, the quarterback from St. John Bosco in Bellflower, California. Some people think he's literally the best quarterback recruit in high school football right now. So he would already be ahead of all those other guys. Although, is there a 5-star quarterback in this class of 2019? I'm leaning towards no there, but this guy would be ranked higher than all of those. So those are 4 right off the bat that I think would legitimately be 5 stars in the class of 2019. You could probably make the argument for Miles Hinton, who's number 6 on 24/7 Sports, McKinley Jackson, who's number 9 on 24/7 Sports, Kendall Milton as well. Leonard Manuel is a freakishly big athlete. So you can make the argument for a group of other guys, but really those 4 in particular, I think are fairly safe in that conversation, whether or not those 2020s would be a 5-star in 2019. Certainly those first couple of guys. And Savell Smalls somehow still doesn't really get his due on the West Coast. Some people think he is already ahead of Kayvon Thibodeau's pace. I've heard a ton of good things. I'm really excited to see him in person at some point. It may have to wait until the opening finals next year. I'm not sure. But I think he's got a chance to be that premier pass rusher and stand alone in that variety. Instead of like Thibodeau in this class where these guys are grouped together. Nolan Smith, Thibodeau, Zach Harrison. It's like they're the top 3 prospects in America, and they all happen to play the same position, so you're going to keep talking about them together. I think Savell Smalls has the potential to separate himself in that 2020 class. So he's another one. And Bama's definitely in it for him, by the way. So he is one that I would actually project right now. If it were signing day 2020, I believe Savell Smalls inks crimson and white. So another reason to keep an eye out with this 2020 group. But another very good question from Raphael Monroy. Again, we're looking back here on Twitter and different avenues because we're a little behind in the Q&A game. So let's shift it over to Facebook a little bit. We got an interesting one from Tobias Brookins, who wants to focus a little bit more on Vandarius Cowan, and it's understandable, so we've got to address it. Tobias says, I'm sure that while I'm typing this, you're going to talk about the dismissal of Vandarius Cowan and what they may mean for the recruitment of Nakobe Dean, the possibility of Umstead Sanders coming in under scholarship. From what I understand, Vandarius was kind of cutting up, but his dismissal is still shocking to me given Saban's past actions of rehabilitating players. I'm thinking Cowan becomes an easy dismissal if his removal makes landing Dean more likely. Going a lot of different ways there, Tobias, but I see where you're going with it initially. As far as Vandarius, a kid that I covered pretty closely as a recruit coming out of South Florida, well-documented off-field, I wouldn't say concerns, but off-field incidents, I guess. Kicked off his high school team, uninvited to the Army All-American Bowl, things like that. So you knew there was something there personality-wise, and he's a very headstrong, bullish type of kid. So you could kind of see that happening and say, okay, it might take him a while, but at Alabama, these things typically work themselves out. And then in the spring, we heard that he was trying to focus on academics, so he really wasn't participating as much, which a lot of people just kind of didn't believe. They thought that there was ulterior motives and ulterior reasons as to why Vandarius wasn't out there for the bulk of spring ball. I'm kind of in that group, but not all the way in that group. So clearly, there's been some situations and extenuous efforts in some capacity by the Alabama coaching staff. And I just think this isn't the result of any one thing. Sure, he punched a dude and it was on tape, which is bad. But I think if the previous buildup hadn't happened, maybe he doesn't get kicked off the team. I think this is one of those where the next big thing would have got him dismissed, regardless of what it was. Now, it happening to get caught on tape and shared made it that much of a quicker snap decision, and rightfully so. But you saw some red flags coming out of high school, and clearly there have been some early in college. But it's a young player, and you hope that he wakes up and moves on somewhere and does some good things there, because he is a nice kid to deal with, and he is a heck of a football talent. Now, how does this affect recruiting? I think it adds to the onus for the need, numbers wise, of an inside linebacker, but Bama was already going to be heavy in that department. You were already going all in for Nakobe Dean. You already celebrated that commitment of Shane Lee. That's already a position we're talking a lot about, right? Christian Harris out of Baton Rouge, Vontae Bentley, Muhammad Diabate in state. We're talking about it a lot already. So I don't know if the board changes or the likelihood of another one comes up, because I don't think there's a lot of linebackers who are depth chart watchers in recruiting. Now, stranger things have happened and nothing is impossible, but typically depth chart watchers are more skill position guys, quarterbacks, receivers, corners, safeties, what have you. It ain't a front seven brute like most linebackers high on Alabama's board. So I don't think it changes a ton with that. Now, what the interesting part of your question, Tobias, is Umstead Sanders. Now, according to Trey, he's already enrolled at Florida. So pretty tough to do anything there. So I think at the end of the day, Bama is going to ride with the linebackers that it currently has on the roster. Not the commitment list, but on the roster, certainly. When it comes to other questions, we got a couple other via Facebook. Cameron Timothy, curious about a West Coast offensive lineman. Cam wants to know, what's the deal with Jonah Ta'uanu? Is he saying he's staying west, or is he considering anyone in the SEC? The kid is fiery and seems to be a legit competitor. Would love to have his spark at Alabama. I see where you're going with this one, Cam, and I'm with you in theory. Just overall, this is a good football player. We saw a lot again at the opening. You guys know where I was focused on. I actually just put Jonah's full video up, and look, I don't make highlights. I put up the full video. So if Jonah went 11-7 at the opening, those 7 losses are on tape. So check out his full body of competitive work, not just the glitz and the glam and the highlights. Anyway, there's not a lot of talk with SEC schools outside of Florida at this point. There aren't any crystal ball predictions for any SEC schools. There is a heavy sense that he stays west in general in this class. There's not a lot of talk with Bama, but I think the reasoning there is because of the numbers. 20 verbal commitments right now, not a ton of spots left, and we know O-line is still busy. Bama has multiple 5-stars high on the board who are active with the Crimson Tide, whether it is Clay Webb, the number 1 player in the state, whether it is Darnell Wright, the number 1 offensive tackle in the top 247. Bama's kind of preoccupied with those guys. Now, could there be some other under-the-radar names offensive line-wise? Absolutely. Wanye Morris was on campus last month camping with the Crimson Tide. His name escapes me right now, but the Colquitt County offensive lineman was on campus. Kamar Bell was on campus multiple times, and he's got Alabama ahead of everyone else on his list, with Auburn, Florida, and a couple of others there in the mix. He's an interior line prospect. Bama's already got 3 good ones committed in Pierce Quick, Amari Kite, and Tanner Bowles. So where is the space for other guys like Jonah under consideration? I just don't see it at this time. Again, spots are limited. I think 5 is going to be the O-line number, possibly 4 in a gray shirt. Don't jump to there just yet. I just want to put it out there. It's going to be talked about at some point if it isn't already. But overall, and how many Bama brings in, I think that number is going to be 5. 3 are already committed, and there's a lot of names for a couple of spots remaining. The dream scenario for Bama, you take Clay Webb and you take Darnell Wright. But obviously easier said than done, and we'll see how much work is to be done. But I think Bama's going to stay on this side of the country for the O-line haul going forward to finish out this class of 2019. But I really like that question. It makes a ton of sense. The O-line recruiting is not going to be talked about as much beyond Clay Webb, but it's still very fluid and there's still movement to be made. Let's go to an Instagram question, shall we? This is coming in from Smitty, aka El Oso Negro on Instagram. Hey John, sorry I've been MIA for the last few pods. No need to apologize there, Smitty. We were MIA on Tuesday. I was giving you a chance to finish up in Texas. My first question here, who will be the top rated recruit in Bama's class this year? That is a good question from Smitty. Who's going to be the highest ranked Alabama football player in this class? Currently, I should say, it is Pierce Quick, of course, the 24/7 Sports Composite 5-star, the only one right now on the Alabama commitment list out of 20 prospects. Now, obviously, when you look at targets, a lot of 5-stars in there. So if that's kind of the pool that Bama's picking from, you got to go with the most likely one, right? There's a new top 247, but this guy's still right there in the top 2 or 3. Kayvon Thibodeau. I'm starting to come around a little bit more on the Bama vibes from Kayvon. I'm starting to come around on a little more. You heard him here on the show with us last week. I think it could happen. FSU still probably a tad more likely, but it's becoming clear that playing in the Southeast is legitimate for Kayvon Thibodeau. And as long as that reigns true and as long as he's taking his time, Bama's going to be in it. I think they get an official visit. The last words he said on the podcast last week were, "I'll be back in Tuscaloosa," and he had already visited twice this year on his dime. So there's certainly some momentum with Alabama. Tosh Lupoy obviously on the case there. So if they can land him, it will be Kayvon Thibodeau, because the only guys I would have ranked higher that Bama is considering, or that Bama would like, is probably Nolan Smith, but the feel is that he sticks with UGA at this time. So I think Kayvon Thibodeau would be my shot for the Bama recruit, who is ranked the highest at the end of the day in this class of 2019. Smitty's got a second question on Instagram. If Bama misses on Trey Sanders, who do I feel is the next guy on the board? I like that. Is this if I'm Nick Saban, or who do I think is the actual next guy on the board? I think that answer might be the same guy, actually. I think Jerry and Ely is kind of the forgotten guy because Bama locked in a running back with Keelan Robinson, and Trey Sanders is really dominating the rest of the conversation when it comes to Alabama and recruiting running backs, period. But Jerry and Ely out of Mississippi, and that's another potential blue chip out of that state, is still pretty hot and heavy with Alabama. Balanced running back. He could counter and offset some of what Keelan Robinson does as well. So I think Bama's going to be in good shape at running back. Like we talked about earlier, when you get one at an important position and you're only going to take maybe one more, you can start filtering down your list a little bit and take some risks in recruiting and the type of guys you're recruiting. So if you're Bama, maybe you just focus on Jaron Ely, and you just focus on Trey Sanders and maybe Tyrion Davis, one or two more guys, and you're done with it, and you let the chips fall where they may. But a very good question coming in via Smitty on Instagram. All right, let's pick up the pace with the remainder of the questions submitted. Josh R. at Insider_Alabama. Breakdown of Byron Young and how he compares to Eboigbe and Alfano. You got kind of my thoughts on Byron Young already. Want to see him in person. Haven't done so just yet. Comparing him to Eboigbe and Alfano. Not as athletic as Alfano. Not as long as Eboigbe. But better in short spaces than maybe both of them. And probably the guy who is going to take the longest to see the field in Tuscaloosa once he gets there, because as I said, I think he slides inside eventually for the Crimson Tide down the line. I think he'll be 300 plus fairly easily in the next 18 months or so. That's my Cliff Notes version. Josh. Carl Lensner jumping in with a question. Good afternoon, John. This is an over-under question. 50% for Daxton Hill coming to Alabama, over or under? I have the same question for Kayvon Thibodeau, the defensive end from California and number one player in the country. Another good question here. The CABC family is bringing it today. Carl, Dax Hill, Kayvon Thibodeau. I think Bama has had more sustained momentum with Dax Hill. I think the race is more narrow with Dax. I think it's two and a half teams there with the Oklahoma schools, as to where with Thibodeau, it's legit 3+ teams. Florida State, Bama, USC, really a strong group of three where any school would feel good about their chances, with Oregon, Florida, and a couple of others kind of there behind. So I think there's by default, by the number, there's more of a chance for Dax. So over under 50%, I would go over on Dax Hill, and I would go very slightly under on Kayvon Thibodeau. But as I said earlier, I'm coming around on Thibodeau to Bama a little bit more as time progresses, much more so than I thought a couple of weeks ago or before I talked to him out at the opening. So I think that's something that is going to continue to head in that direction, especially if he does indeed end up back in Tuscaloosa for another visit, as he says he will going forward. Another one in from Carl, I should say. You have said that Alabama wants 3 safeties in this class. Right now they have 2. Who would they consider taking 4 if those players are Nick Cross and Daxton Hill? Thanks for answering my questions. Carl, yes, I think Bama would take all 4 of those guys, and I don't know if there would be some attrition on the commitment list, but I think if you're Bama, you take those 4 guys, especially if it's sooner rather than later. And we know both of those guys, Cross and Hill, are thinking about committing fairly soon. So Bama could theoretically end up with both, although I think Daxton Hill is more likely than Nick Cross. I think Nick Cross is more of a Florida State kind of situation at this point. But, things can change. But I do think if both guys called on Nick right now, they would take both of those safeties, and this would become a ridiculously talented class at that position. Rafael Monroy back for more. Hope all is well. You said that the 2020 class will be big for Bama in Cali. Could you elaborate? I can, Rafael. The guy I talked about earlier, I thought was from California, Savell Smalls, who I said if I had to project him on signing day, I'd have him signing with Bama. He is a West Coaster, and he is in the Pacific time zone, but he's from Washington, actually. So that kind of caught me off guard a little bit, but nonetheless, we'll throw him into our Cali conversation. I feel good about Bama's chances there. Some of the guys we mentioned earlier, Justin Flo, Bama heavily in the mix. DJ Yui Galele, heavily in the mix for Bama. Kendall Milton, the running back, has an Alabama offer. There's a couple of other guys in California who have Bama in the conversation, like Elias Ricks, who was another underclassman at the opening. He has a Crimson Tide offer, and there's several others there as well, but particularly those guys at the top. I think Savell Smalls, Justin Flo, Uwe Galele, Kendall Milton, those four. I'd be surprised if Bama doesn't land one or two of those. And this is very early, and we know the board can and will change, but it just seems like Bama's not going to miss completely in Cali next year. And heck, they may not miss this year as we keep talking about some momentum between Alabama and Kayvon Thibodeau. Josh back for more at insider_Alabama. This is a fun one. Which group would you take and why? Group A, Patrick Surtain and Tyson Campbell. Group B, Derek Stingley and Akeem Dent. Group C, Keely Ringo and Elias Ricks. Group D, Ringo and Stingley. So we're going through multiple classes and obviously multiple guys who hadn't signed anywhere yet or are signed to different programs. This is a fun one. This is a DB scenario question. I'm going to tell you right off the bat, Josh, I'm not as familiar with Ringo, so C and D are kind of eliminated by default. But A and B, man, Surtain and Campbell versus Stingley and Dent. Whew. Well, out of the four, Surtain is the most college ready and polished and best overall player. But Stingley has some is similar with the player comparison. I think there is some similarity between Surtain and Stingley. Surtain longer, Stingley probably a tad faster, maybe more physical, but Surtain more polished than Derek. That is a good comp between the two. I think they were the clear number one corners in their class. So if it is close to a push, you look at the second guys there, Tyson Campbell and Akeem Dent. Again, this is fun because these guys are opposites. So who do you take? Tyson Campbell, longer, leaner, faster, versus Akeem Dent, more polished, more conventional, apex, ball skills, can play nickel, savvy, instinctive, maybe quicker. That is very hard. That is a very hard thing. Um, I lean towards A because of Surtain. I just think he's that much better than every corner in the last few years. But Campbell versus Dent, I would take Akeem Dent right now. Now, Tyson is the more, head-turning numbers guy in terms of height, weight, speed, all of those things. But there's something about Akeem Dent. He is relentless. He's a competitor. He can play inside. He's the type of guy that you look up 10 years from now, and he's played 8 years in the NFL, and he's been to the Pro Bowl 2 or 3 times, and he's not getting the, shutdown corner award. He's not on the first team all-pro team, but man, he's just there every single day working, breaking up passes, and helping lock down a secondary. As to where Campbell, if you told me he had a great NFL career or he never made it to the NFL, I would believe both. It wouldn't shock me either way. I just think there's more boom or bust in Tyson Campbell than Akeem Dent. So if you put Patrick Surtain and Dent together, that would be my dream group from this list in terms of guys to complement one another. But raw talent and cover skills, I think Surtain and Stingley are the top two. But man, this 5-star cornerbacks. I mean, we could. Josh, you got me on one here. We can go all day long with something like that. But a very, very good question. That'll be a fun one to document and revisit like 5 years from now, just so we can laugh at how wrong I actually am. Couple more questions coming in via Twitter. Brian Perkins and Lance White. Look, guys, I apologize. I apologize for Tuesday. It is never my goal to not have a podcast on a scheduled date, but I promise we will begin and continue to make it up to you. We're running long today, well over an hour, and we're getting closer to potentially 3 shows a week. So we will have a ton of coverage, and we're trying to make it the best possible coverage that we can. And then the final question of today's program, and hence this week of Crimson and Blue Chips, is one of my favorites because it starts off with kind of wanted to call you out here, John. At JS Roll Tide, you get the show. This is what we want. Please call me out. I am going to be wrong. I'm probably going to contradict myself every now and then. Please call me out. Here is what Jay had to say. Kind of wanted to call you out here, John. You said on a podcast recently that you thought if you put Trey Sanders in the last class, he'd be the number 4 running back in that class. But how can that be? They don't rank a player based on how strong or weak a class is. They rank them as a prospect. Trey Sanders would still be close to his ranking now, but what you were saying is you would have him no better than number 81. They rank a player based off of him and nobody else. There is no way they would have the number 80 prospect in the class ahead of the number 7 prospect in the class. Trey Sanders is a 5-star prospect in any class. Just wanted you to clarify your comments. I will, Jay, and thanks again for asking. 2 things. One, I was just putting him among the running backs, and we actually do rank guys in order on the position scale. At the opening, Barton Simmons, Steve Wiltfong, Luke Stampini, me, everybody there representing 24/7 Sports. I mean, we're having the Nolan Smith, Kayvon Thibodeau, Zach Harrison discussion 2 or 3 times a day. So, yeah, in a general sense, the rankings are to reflect the NFL draft. So, positionally, you can have several 5 stars at one position. I don't think that's too hard to comprehend. But when you are talking about guys at the same position, they absolutely get pitted against one another. So for that exercise, if my memory serves, we were putting Trey Sanders against the other running backs and seeing where he would fall. And he was somewhere in between, I believe, Lorenzo Lingard and another guy. So that would put him just on the bubble of 5-star status, just in looking at those running backs. Definitely wouldn't have said that he is the number 80 player in the country, which is not that close to 5-star status. If that was how it was interpreted, then I did not communicate it the way that I had desired. However, I do disagree with you, Jay, in that Trey Sanders is a 5-star prospect in any class. I don't have Trey as a 5-star. I don't know if there's a 5-star back in this class. I think there are some very good running backs. I think there are some running backs that are deserved of 5-star consideration, including Trey Sanders. But I'm not in love with this running back class as a whole. And I think that there are holes, no pun intended there, in the game of a lot of these running backs at the top of the list. Trey Sanders just not as fluid as you would want for the top back in the country, and a guy who some people think is still better suited to play defense. Now, I've come around on that conversation, and again, we're splitting hairs here. Trey Sanders, if you're listening, we're splitting hairs here. 5-star running backs to me are guys who I envision going in the first round of the NFL draft one day. And for now, for me, having seen him live a bunch and on tape even more, I'm not there on Trey. Now, in the recruiting era, the number 1 running back in the country is probably going to be a 5-star. That's kind of where we are at this point. It's right or wrong. It's not the best thing in the world, but it is what it is. Now, a guy who I think has the tools in this era to have more of that 5-star stuff, for me, is actually John Emery out of Louisiana. He's the guy that I think should be under more number 1 running back in the country consideration. But if you look right now on the 24/7 Sports rankings, the pre Thursday 24/7 Sports rankings, as I'm not sure when that new top 247 is dropping. Trey Sanders is number 6, and not Ely, and Emory is way down. I say way down, but he's down at 48 overall. I don't think there's 40 players in between those guys. After that, Jerry Ely is the number 3 back on 24/7 Sports. I definitely don't think he's a 5-star. And then there's a huge drop off after that, and only one other running back, or 2 other running backs in the top 100 with Noah Cain and Austin Jones. Both of those guys are limited in their skill sets. But I'm not necessarily there with Trey, and I definitely don't believe he is a 5-star for sure, no matter what class he's in. I think that's a very bold statement, and I think he could become that. But right now, I'm not there with Trey Sanders. I think that he has a lack of fluidity and movement skills laterally. And I'm not talking about juking a guy once in a drill or something like that. I'm talking about on the football field. Now, does he run with great lean, power, better speed than you think, with good vision and instincts? Yes, he does all of those things. I mean, he's the number 1 running back in the country, for goodness sakes. But he seems more conventional than built for this era. And the guys who are going in the first round of the NFL draft as running backs, Ezekiel Elliott, Todd Gurley, these type of guys, Saquon Barkley, obviously, just a couple months back, these guys are built for this era. They can run it, they can catch it, they can block it, they can split out if you need to. They're matchup nightmares. I don't see all of that right now in the forecast for Trey Sanders. Now, the argument for best back in this class, I think he's there. The argument for 5-star status, I think he's still there. But personally, I don't think he's one of those where you just lock in as a 5-star and you're like, oh yeah, he's the guy. I really like the Emory kid out of Louisiana from what I've seen. But I've seen much more of Trey. So maybe I'm just over-scouting Trey. But I do think there's still some conversation about that 5-star status. So anyway, that's where we're at with that conversation. But we do rank guys relative to their position when it comes to that. But yeah, the thought is to get the top 32 to match the NFL draft. It's very, very simple. And obviously, NFL teams have guys on their board to be on their board. It's not just based off of position. We hear the words best available all the time around the NFL draft and things, or around any draft and things like that. So I think that certainly applies to the rankings, and that's where that's where we need to be. That is where we need to be. So I see where you're going with your argument, but definitely don't think Trey Sanders is a no-brainer Najee Harris, Cam Akers, Derrick Henry, number 1 back in the country type of 5-star guy that we've seen in the past 5 years or so. So that's where I'm at with that. But I love it. Keep calling me out. And again, if I didn't communicate that the right way, I apologize. Was not my intent. But we'll continue to get better at it in future editions of the podcast. And we certainly thank you for listening to this Thursday edition of the show. Again, our thoughts are with Eddie Rico and the company out in California. Please continue to do so if you guys have been praying for him and his family as well. We appreciate that here at CABC. And yeah, have a great weekend, everybody. We're in the middle of a dead period, but it ain't so dead, is it? That's the beauty of it, and that's why you come back to us at #CABC. God bless. Garcia out.
You've been listening to Crimson and Blue Chips with John Garcia Jr. Please be sure to tune in again on Tuesday. Until then, keep up with all the news on Twitter at CABCPOD.